Hi, I'm Patrick Pullen, one of the co-founders of API Fortress, and today I'd like to chat with you guys about API testing, where it is today, where it's going. A lot's changed since back in the days of just using SOAP UI or code. There's a lot of involvement in with the progress of CI/CD. That's been especially true as of late. So first, who am I? Again, Patrick from API Fortress, one of the co-founders here. API Fortress has been around for about 5 years, and my background was I was working in mobile web technology. It's where I met my co-founder. We're building like the first mobile apps and mobile websites for large retailers, hotels, things of that nature. That was back in the day when you had to scroll in on a mobile phone to see the website because they didn't have mobile specific versions of the websites. So that's where I started. But then that moved quickly into API. So a lot of my old coworkers moved on to the Masheries and the Apogees of the world, and I actually moved on to Getty Images, where I was the sales engineer, specifically for the API that they were building and they wanted to set up. And we had this interesting thing where we had a customer who didn't make revenue for 24 hours. And we didn't realize that there was a technical issue. And their technical team didn't realize it either. It was their accounting team that caught it the next day and said, hey, we haven't made money in 24 hours. Long story short, we had made a release that had only a couple small changes, but only their platform took in those changes so poorly. So it was a very small nuanced thing, but the reality is we had no logging, no monitoring, no testing of this thing. Like this, they would just hit it with Postman a couple times manually and be like, all right, the API responds, and just move on. So I immediately started looking for a better solution and realized there just isn't something out there. You know, SOAP UI and Postmans, they're good starts, but they're not what you're supposed to be using and how you expect to use things in today's ecosystem with CI/CD and all those things. And so that's where my co-founder and I started. And that's the idea and the premise and where it started from. So from a higher level, like what is it when we talk about continuous quality? There's a lot of buzzwords in this industry, and it's beneficial in some ways, but in other ways it's kind of annoying because it makes it difficult for you to choose what you're testing for. So to be more clear, continuous quality to us means basically three facets. One is quality, clear enough, functional tests, so forth. The other two are a little more unique, and it's because we have more of a unique understanding of what this stuff means. So reliability means uptime, but not just uptime. And this is where the Getty Images experience for me taught me a lot, because the API was up, but it had a functional issue. And so functionally it was down, if you think about it that way. So for us, what we talk about now, and it's something we really push people on, is don't just look at uptime, look at functional uptime. Running the functional tests as monitors truly validates where you're at. And then the last one is security, and security is another one that's a really big buzzword. There's a lot of companies that are talking about API security, and the reality is like there's no perfect AI genius solution out there. But that's because the majority of issues that are security related, over 95%, are actually functional errors put live. So to make that more clear, here's just three. So on our blog, apifortress.com/blog, we have some of these examples of things that went wrong. And one of all three of these we have a blog post about. And it's just this really interesting thing where it's not necessarily a hacker. People want to talk about hackers and hacking and all this cool stuff. The reality is people just screw up, put stuff live that they shouldn't. So Twitter wasn't a hacker. They literally just had two different APIs, but when you work with them together, and since they didn't have any throttle limiting, you were able to reverse engineer people's personal emails for their Twitter accounts. India just made an API live that they shouldn't have and allowed anyone to validate someone's personal identification number to the government. So think of it like in America, we have social security numbers. You were able to search anyone on earth just randomly through this API that they put live by accident as a method to validate someone's social security number to sign up for, I think it was electricity. And the United States Postal Service did something even sillier where you were able to do a search, but instead of being able to search specifically for your tracking number, you could just search by a wildcard and it gave you everything. These are not hacks. These are very small functional things that end up being catastrophically huge issues. And it comes back to the core of its functional testing. 95% of the issues that deal with security and these breaches, quote unquote, aren't hacks. It isn't Snowden doing amazing things. It's literally just a functional error put live, or a lack of throttling, or just an oversight by a team. So what we were talking about before, continuous quality. What really does it mean besides just the buzzwords? So we were able to break it down into something that's a little more realistic based on what we see in today's CI/CDs architectures. Like the DevOps Agile shift has really changed things. And so for us, one of the biggest things we see is functional testing at the core of everything. Functional integration testing, you can call it end-to-end testing, data-driven testing, ultimately like creating tests that go far beyond just hit an endpoint and get a response. If you have a large API program, let's say you're an e-commerce company, you should have search, add to cart, checkout. That's just one flow. You should be reproducing entire consumer flows on an API level. And so all of that should work together. So you create these series of really, really smart, good tests, and then you use them not just for your automated testing as part of your like deployments automatically. You should also just be using them as your performance test. Why not use it as a load test? And then why not use those same tests as a monitor? It literally just means running it every 5 minutes against production. There's a functional uptime monitor. It seems basic and silly, but it is done shockingly rarely. And that's just one of those things that we really try to push on because, what we do is specific to this. These are the tenets, performance, uptime, and just functionality. Those should be at the core of all API testing, all three of them. And what we see is people picking and choosing which pieces they want to focus on, which just isn't the right thing in our opinion. And just based on like our last 5 years of doing this. So to make it a little more concrete, let's sort of dive into what a good functional test is. And so, if you guys know what an API is, obviously like an API is it's almost like a book. I like to make that analogy for people that don't know what APIs are, but it's a bunch of data that's very structured. And if the data isn't right, so if the object doesn't match the expectations of the data, that's an issue. If it's not sorted properly in a repeatable fashion, that's an issue. All of these things matter. So you're really proofreading this book constantly for every single missing comma can mess everything up. I think that's actually what the Getty issue was I was speaking to earlier. So you need everything validated on every level. So what does that mean? Well, it means you're doing exactly what you would do if you were a consumer, but on the API level. So for example, we had a book retailer and they were running tests, but they were running one endpoint at a time. So when we came in, we actually did an end-to-end test. We did one endpoint, gave you all of the products, and then we used 100 of those product IDs and jumped into those individually to see if they were there as well. And we ended up catching a huge issue for them. And that issue is, this seems silly, but what was happening was every Monday they were updating their database. And so every Monday, if you hit the listing API to say, hey, what are all the products available? And then followed up and hit the product details of hundreds of those that came in because we were using an API as the data source. Every Monday morning, we're getting issues. Long story short, what was happening is they were using an API manager and they were caching the endpoint, which is great for performance. But what happens when you don't clear the cache after doing a database update? You end up with hours of bad product IDs. And they had no idea this was happening for months until we had created that end-to-end test for them and helped them do that sort of testing. So again, you want to reproduce consumer flows on the API level as much as possible. End-to-end, you want to be data-driven. Don't just use a stagnant CSV. We're dealing with APIs. The APIs are data. Use APIs as your data as much as you can. And again, it comes into what we were saying before. It's at the core of everything should be these really smart functional tests that go through multiple steps and then use it not just as an automated test as part of your deployments, run it as a stress test and then run it as a monitor. If your stress test is just hitting one endpoint and just checking to make sure the status code responds, that's not a real stress test, because what happens when your API depends on multiple databases and one of the databases can't keep up? Well, you need to validate every single object to make sure that all of the databases are keeping up when you're doing 5,000 per second or so. So the show me how, we're just going to dive into this slightly just to show you more concrete, because I don't love just talking about the theoreticals that much. I want to focus in on this a little bit. So show you how is, so here's an example API and here's an example response. So what we want to do here is we want to make sure that quantity, that object exists, but then the quantity obviously here should be a whole number. So you not only want to validate quantities there, you want to validate that it's a whole number. Colors, there's going to be a series of colors. You're like, all right, make sure color is red, white, blue, yellow, etc. Price should be a float. Name has to exist. Image URL, that's a big one. We see this all the time where you have an image URL object and the actual data associated with it isn't a properly formatted URL, or it's giving you an HTTP instead of an HTTPS. Those are the sorts of things you want to validate. So that's just what you want to do on a single endpoint. Just get every single detail right. Make sure it's, hey, all of these products should have category, ID, description, and name. Make sure that's part of your functional test, and then validate the data that comes through with that. Then the next part is actually connecting those pieces. So using one endpoint to inform a subsequent endpoint. So that's what I was saying before with the book publisher example that was one of our earliest customers. You can use your own APIs as data, and you should be doing that. Because if you're depending on the CSV, there's a very good chance you're missing hundreds of uncaught errors, which are the most difficult and expensive errors that you can possibly have. So you must, as much as possible, use dynamic data. Not only that, use production data. Sometimes a lot of people are just using test data, and even if it's dynamic, it's still just test data. We had one customer whereby the biggest issue they had was that they allowed customers to upload information, but their upload process was broken for one specific object, and it allowed them to upload bad product categories. So it was missing product categories because the upload page wasn't working right. But that's something you only catch. If you miss it on the website, you can catch it in an API test that's properly formatted. So we said category should be one of these 10 options. Well, suddenly we were finding these null, and null wasn't supposed to be an option. We were forcing them to make a choice. That was caught with a functional API test. And that's the sort of stuff you can catch with API tests. APIs aren't just up or down. There's a lot of nuance, and a lot of it can come back to the data that's actually part of it. So don't be afraid to hit the production environment and check out the production data as part of your test. And so again, if you're really going into what this stuff means, like what we think should be done is pretty clear. Like when you have, if you're e-commerce, you're going to do search, you're going to add to cart, and you're going to check out. That should be one test. It's most companies these days, you're able to do that entirely on an API level. So you should be doing it on an API level. Don't just hit one or two endpoints. An endpoint responding with test data is not a test. You wouldn't allow it for website testing. You shouldn't allow it here. Like go into depth and detail. And if that's too difficult, it's just because you haven't found the right tool or platform or choice or team members or whatever it is. There are options out there that can empower almost anyone to do this sort of thing. And that's where the focus should be. Entire end-to-end test. So again, just in summary, what we're talking about here, smart functional tests connected together to create end-to-end tests, make sure they're data-driven, and then use them as the core of not just your automated tests as part of your CI pipelines. Use them as a load test and use them as a monitor as well. If you have the right tool, this is all easily done, and it's absolutely necessary because APIs are now running everything. So one of the most important aspects that leads to issues, and it leads to people that we end up having to have conversations with and helping them fix, is the siloing effect of this stuff. So you might have one person using Postman, another using SOAP UI, and another writing code, and a third trying to use API Fortress. Whatever it is, there's siloing happening. So you might have 5 developers with one QA in it, and those QAs are not working together. This is in particular an issue when you're talking about creating end-to-end tests. Because we have some customers that say, no, it's not an issue, we don't need QAs, our developers write all their own tests. Okay, thing is your developer might be building search endpoint. He's going to build a test for search. Someone else might be building an endpoint for product details. Who's connecting all of those pieces into that end-to-end test? That's where a testing professional comes in. So every time I'm given that question, I'm told by someone like, hey, we don't have QAs because our developers do all that stuff. I'm like, great, but who's creating your end-to-end tests? Who's doing that full across-the-board integration test? And that's where it really comes down to maybe choosing the right system or the right process for your organization. Because there's no reason why a developer can't write their own test. But you still need one person on top, not just creating tests that validate that it works. They're creating tests that really make sure, will it work if I try to break it? That's what a testing expert really is in control of. They're a domain expert in breaking things and coming up with off-the-wall ideas. But that's what you need to do. You need to come up with these crazy off-the-wall ideas so that you can work all together. Like the whole team should be working as part of one system. So if one person doesn't think of a test, this testing expert will hopefully think of the test. And the benefit to that is you end up not having the issue that the United States Postal Service had, whereby you could search by wildcard. Well, the developer probably wouldn't have thought of writing a test for that because he put that live. He shouldn't have put that. He shouldn't have made that a possible option, but it was. So he didn't think about it. So where was the system of checks and balances? And that's why I think like the most important things to do is get everyone on the same system, even if you have to force them. It doesn't matter if they're all on the same system. You're saving from a lot of redundancies because developer might write one functional test, but then the QA expert can just come in, connect all these functional tests, and create super tests, for example. Sort of a dumb, glib way to say it, but that's if everyone's using the same system, you will realize huge efficiencies of scale. And so it's absolutely critical that you don't just let the QAs do what they want and the developers do what they want when it comes to testing. There needs to be a coordinated system amongst the team. So we were talking about, the tenets of testing, and we were talking about monitoring. And so I just want to go into that a little bit more here. And it's production monitoring is hugely important, and it's more important now than ever before because all of this web traffic comes through API. So it's all API based. But again, like I was saying earlier, the VP of Gartner himself says it, 95% of security issues are the customer's fault. That's human error. That's what we're talking about there. You made the wildcard search possible and you put it live. You put something live that allows you to search for any human being on earth without throttling it. So people could just hit it with a bunch of random social security numbers and get all this information. That's where this stuff comes from. These three, like 1.1 billion identities released by India. Why? It was a functional error. It wasn't anything criminal. It wasn't a super hacker. Just a couple people messed up, and there wasn't a system of checks and balances in place that actually made sure that this wouldn't happen. So what did actually happen? And so what was missing? And so for us, the way that you make sure you don't have critical issues like the three we spoke to earlier is by doing the same thing. So like, we want a CI/CD process in place. That's what you want. That's what most people want, because you want to make these continuous improvement, continuous builds. So what's interesting is you're writing code, you're deploying it to staging, and you're running automated tests against staging. And then there's a pre-prod or testing environment, and you're running all those automated tests as part of that as well. But then when you go live, you might just run the synthetic tests one more time, your functional tests one more time, and then you're done. And that's where the issue often lies. Just because you ran the test, you ran all of your tests once against staging and once against testing, and then once more just before it was on live, that's not enough. Because again, a lot of the issues can be related to production data, or just the production environment has an issue. So you want to be using the same tests you're using for staging and testing as functional tests. Schedule those to run every 5 minutes against production, for example. It's as simple as that, and I promise you, you will catch things within a week that you had never known existed. There are so many functional issues uncaught today because you're not running functional tests against that production environment. You're just running it maybe a small CSV against a series of basic endpoint tests against your testing environment, and then you're live. An API is a living, breathing thing, and it's very fluid. You want to make sure everything's always existing. So something I'm asked all the time by people that are in the testing space and they know this is an issue. They say the issue isn't recognizing that's a problem, it's that it's propagating it to management to get them to recognize it so that they can dedicate resources, money, whatever is necessary to fix it. So how do you do that? And so this isn't always the easiest. It depends on every organization. What I will say is that there's a lot of paperwork out there by Forrester and Gartner talking about making the shift. It used to be 80-20 web testing versus API testing, and it should be shifting 20-80, 20 web, 80% API testing. There's a lot of interesting industry information out there by the Forrester and the Gartners of the world. SmartBear releases a State of the API report. Postman has one as well. There's a lot of detail. If you go to our website, we have solution briefs and ebooks at apifortress.com under resources. We have a bunch of information to sort of convey all of these issues on a management level and what the results are. But what I will say is that sometimes it's easier just to give them an analogy. So for me, like when I'm trying to, like just recently I was pushed to say, well, why should we monitor production if it's working on staging? And so what they were actually asking was, well, why should we extend all of these big tests to production when I'm already using a New Relic, for example, or a Datadog that does synthetic testing? Why should I use your tests? And so the analogy I made was like, just imagine you're a parent, you have a child in school, and you want to make sure that they're being educated properly in school. So how do you measure the progress of a child in history? Well, do you measure it by their attendance? Because that's what uptime is. No, of course not. You measure it because you test them. Test them on the actual information. Like, to me, that's what a functional test is. It's going beyond attendance to prove that they're learning something and to actually ask them about every single item. So that's sort of my analogy for like why you need to just test in production and use the same things you were using before. Like production testing is monitoring. Just put it on a schedule and it's called monitoring. That's one of the things that I think people lose track of, because there's a lot of tools out there for monitoring, but they do different things, but they're not doing what's necessary for API technology, for RESTful APIs and SOAP APIs. What they're doing is there's an application performance monitors out there, APMs. They're validating that the servers are processing data at a good speed. That's great. Make sure the servers are up. That's great. We're talking about APIs. We're talking about data. What we're talking about, again, is a book. It's a book of information. This is what we need to validate. Just the API responding, but if it responds with a 200 but it's a soft error code and it has no information, that's a catastrophic failure. So that is what we mean by production monitoring. And part of that, and part of the big item with that, is getting away from stagnant data, getting away from CSVs, getting away from just an old database. Like, it needs to be dynamic and constantly refreshed in some capacity. And so that's one of the core tenets of proper monitoring, and one of the core reasons to do it is because you're using that new data and that fresh data. So again, I'm reiterating this, but it's because I want to clarify it. If you're an e-commerce company, search, add to cart, checkout. That's one test. And what you're searching for should be hugely dynamic, and it should run oftentimes against production. You should do a monitor of this stuff, because you might have your test server might just have basic information, so you could only search for the word red and 4. Those are the only two things that will result in anything anyway. That's not a real test. That's using the best case scenario and only asking it questions you know it can answer. That's not really testing it. So what you want to create is these really smart tests, and if you're constrained because the test environment doesn't have that information, not a problem, because once it's live, use that same test that's smart, but put it against live, and you'll get a lot more results and see a lot more flexibility. Sometimes we get a pushback of, well, isn't that going to skew our data? If you're working for a large organization, running one API test that hits 3 endpoints every 5 minutes is such a minimal amount of change on your system. And there's also ways around it whereby you can specifically change the user agent or something. So identify it as specifically, this is a test, don't put it as part of our Google Analytics. That's all possible. Don't be concerned about adding one hit every 5 minutes to your website, to your production website, because that's how you're going to make sure that it's actually working. So if you want to see a little more specifically what we're talking about, this is an example of it's just an example test, but it's a sort of thing we show people all the time that's you should be doing. And so this is sort of in our platform, what you see at the very top, this is an active API test. It gets an API response, and this is the product listing. So it'll tell you like, hey, there's 100 items available, item ID 1, 2, 3, 4 to 100. So it validates that first response, that first payload. It says make the call and let's validate all the objects in here. But then you'll see in the middle of it says for each. And so then we're just talking about some basic programmatic maneuvering, whereby right below that you see we're setting a variable ID. We're setting a variable that variable's ID using product ID. Then right after that, it makes a get call. And that's the product detail get call. So the first call gives us all these product IDs. We store those IDs, and then we iterate on every single one. So you can iterate on 20 of these randomly, or you can do every single one like we're doing here. These are the sorts of things that you should be seeing from all of your API tests. And those tests should be used as load tests, performance tests, and monitors as well. So people ask us, like, what's a good number to aim for? 99.8 functional uptime. So people to date, often, they're just looking at 99.8 as uptime. That's not functional uptime. That's just uptime. The test I just showed you, running that constantly, improving that works 99.8. That's the 99.8 you want to aim for. One of the biggest items that's the most difficult to convey, but it's the most important to communicate, is that uncaught errors, false positive tests, are the biggest problem a company can face today. One, you might be losing sales and conversions, and you don't even know it because you're not catching these issues. But the second one goes back to what I was saying before, whereby API Fortress is not a security company. But what I can tell you is that we're a functional testing company, platform. Our company sells this platform that does functional testing of APIs and monitors. And that is 95% of the issues that hackers get in through, because they're not doing any sort of crazy hacking. They're just finding that I could search by wildcard and then grabbing everyone's information. That's it. It's as simple as that. Functional testing is 95% of the issues you will see when it comes to security breaches. And that's what you need to focus on. And that's something you need to communicate to your team, and go back to what that Gartner quote was. And this deck you could download and share. This is a thing that people, 83% of data travels through APIs today, and 95% of issues of API issues are just human error. So why is it happening whereby monitoring isn't being done well? And I say that as an API monitoring company. We do functional testing and monitoring. I'm telling you, API monitoring is done poorly. We never walk into a potential customer meeting and say, wow, you guys are great. There's nothing here that can be improved upon. And so here's why, and this goes back to what I was saying before about these APMs. They're selling on the keyword monitoring, and they have huge teams. They're billion-dollar companies. They're super successful, and so they're the kings of monitoring. The problem is they're application performance monitors. But now with APIs being 83% of all the web traffic, they're trying to push themselves into this market without having the foundation for it. So what I mean by that is, these are 3 of the 6 of the largest monitors out there: the New Relics, Dynatrace, AppDynamics, Datadog. They're huge, and they're huge when it comes to monitoring. The problem is, and this is something that if you work in the industry like I do, you start seeing the buzzwords. So like Datadog, you'll be like, all right, yeah, we do synthetic API monitoring. You got to watch out for that word synthetic, because that's where the issue is. And that's where the issue is with all of these. So when they're saying they're doing synthetic testing, it's a status code check. You might be able to validate if this object is in the payload. It is not functional testing. It is just pinging it and making sure a couple items are there. The next issue is the siloing effect. So you have a team at your organization, if it's a large organization that owns New Relic or Datadog. That team are not testing experts, number one. Number two, they're not domain knowledge experts of your API. So the wrong people are being put in charge of testing the API, so they don't know that you're supposed to do search, add to cart, checkout as one flow. Because number one, you can't do it in their platforms, and number two, that's just not what their job is. They do other types of monitoring, and they're being shoved into this API monitoring aspect, but they're completely lacking in the education to do that, because that's not their job. They're domain experts at their own thing, but not in terms of API functionality. So that's a big item that's resulting in this, like, oh, don't worry, we'll just add the new feature to New Relic where we can now do API synthetic testing. It's not the right people. Next is just using a different platform. So they would have to rewrite all your functional tests for whatever platform they're in. So if you're using API Fortress, and then you want to use Datadog for API monitoring, completely different types of tests. They're very minimal, and they're not quite right for you. And it's going to be a different team building them as well, so they don't have that domain expertise either. And then finally, it's just, again, you want to create tests that capture real-world behavior. Search, add to cart, checkout as one monitor. That's critical. It's just not an option. It's not a possibility without a lot of hacking, and it's just not built for that. These huge successful platforms built on APMs, they're great at what they do. They're trying to get into the world of like API monitoring, and they're not built for that. Maybe someday they will, but right now they're not there. You should be using an API testing platform as your monitor. So again, just sort of in a nutshell, you have a team of experts that is in charge of testing your APIs. But then you have a different team of experts that runs the APMs. What you need to do is make them all work together to monitor not API uptime, but API functional uptime. Domain experts in the automated testing team working with the monitoring team if you need to. But I'm of the opinion that you shouldn't even be working with the monitoring team. It should be the automated testing team just setting up monitors themselves against production testing in all those environments. That's how I think this gets fixed. Let the testing experts monitor APIs because they're the ones that know how it should run functionally. And a functional monitor is the only true validation of how the API should be running. So to just finalize all of this stuff as quickly as possible, you reduce your risk, security risks, by using proper functional tests written by people with domain knowledge, experts in API experts in test, number one. Number two, they know what the API should be achieving. Not only that, but you catch so many more bugs and vulnerabilities, especially if you go against production, because against staging, there might be none because you're only testing against 2 keywords against a CSV. Like, it's a very stable environment. What happens when we go to production? It's a little wilder. I can't stress this enough. 95% of these breaches, and this isn't my number, this is Gartner's number, human error. And it's true, because every time we read about an API breach, the team and I review it and write a blog about it, because we realize, like, this is true. Yet again, it proved itself again. This was just allowing to search by wildcard. Should have never been put live. This stuff happens in live environments, and you don't catch it until late, and you don't even know how long it's been living out there and how much you've lost. You want to be doing this level of testing from day one against every environment, including production. So some of the benefits, though, of monitoring are that actually you don't have to add more IT resources. Again, it's the testing team that could do monitoring. You don't need to spend more money on Datadog or New Relic or AppDynamics. You use your existing API testing tool and schedule it to run constantly, every 5 minutes, every 10 minutes, even if you want, every 1 minute, whatever you choose. Use the same people using the same tools you already have today. Obviously, you're deploying a lot faster with a lot more confidence because the tests are running constantly. So you're catching things as early as possible and you're deploying with confidence at all times. And ultimately, you've got to work across the team. If you're not working across teams and you're having silos, it'll take years to break out of that silo and to fix the issues because you're just reinforcing the fork in the road more and more, which is unfortunate. So one thing we do have, if you want to go to this URL, is we actually created a checklist of things your organization would want to keep an eye out for when making API testing and monitoring decisions. So specifically, if you're choosing to build your own or maybe buy something or trial something, this checklist gives you an idea of all the things you should be keeping track of and considering when making a decision. Because I admit it to myself all the time, I don't know what I don't know. So if you're trying to figure out what it is you should be looking for when it comes to making an API like procedural decision, when it comes to testing, monitoring, load testing, stress testing, end-to-end testing, data-driven testing, we created this quick little checklist just to make your choices easier, just so that you have an idea of a list of things to keep an eye out for. So now I'd like to go over the most frequently asked questions for us here at API Fortress. This includes the questions we get from our support portal or on our live chat, or just stuff like our sales engineer team gets asked every day. So what's the first one? What if the data API is behind a firewall? This is actually a huge thing to consider, and it's something that we have on our checklist to think about. So that if you want to use a platform that's like a monitor that's on a, so we have a cloud version, APIfortress.com. APIfortress.com lives in our AWS in Virginia. We can't get into behind your firewall to private APIs with like internal data. That's why a huge portion, about 2/3 of our customers actually are given the container. Our whole platform's a container, and they deploy it on-prem. So they deploy it within their own cloud. So that's something you have to keep track of when it comes to monitoring APIs, making sure that the APIs you want to monitor are accessible from either the third-party tool, if that's what you intend to use, like a Datadog, they have to be able to get to it, or you just deploy your system on-prem, like you can do with us, or if you build something internally. How do I convince management to run tests on production? This is the part that's interesting to me. If you have a large organization, you tell them simply 5 tests every 5 minutes. That's it. It's 25 hits, we get millions per month. I'm just asking for 25. And what if we switch the user agent? Or what if we process like a search, checkout, add to cart, but use a 41111 credit card, so it doesn't actually process anything? That's something we used to do back in our mobile web days. Like there are ways to set it up so that it won't mess up your analytics, but ultimately it's a drop in the bucket either way. But it's absolutely critical. And if you just, again, go to our website, we have resources, we reference Gartner and Forrester and all those other large organizations that speak to management far better than we do sometimes. Check it out. There's a lot of information out there, especially on our website under resources, to help make that communication easier. What if we don't have a spec? So this is actually common. Most people don't. So people think like, oh, we know everyone has Swagger now, but we don't have our Swagger isn't done yet. No one's Swagger is done yet. People are building new APIs, and they're doing a pretty okay job at having definition files for theirs. But a lot of organizations already had hundreds of APIs that are totally undefined. So the reality is, like our platform, you could generate a test, but you can generate off a spec file or off the payload itself, because the majority of the time there is no spec file or it's unreliable. We get bad specs all the time. People ask, why can't I generate a test from the spec? The spec's full of errors. It happens. It's unfortunate, but the reality is no one is perfectly defined, so don't think having a spec is necessary, because almost no one has a good spec. That spec process is only starting to get better now. Status code is an interesting one. So how I was saying, like, if you just do a test and get a 200 response, that's not nearly enough of a test. But one thing to keep in mind of is your tests, I was talking about creating these end-to-end tests, search, add to cart, checkout. Also with that, there's a status code variable in there. So what if you do if statements? If it's a 200, do this. If it's a 401, expect this, but don't move on from there. That sort of nested testing leads to positive and negative tests in one test. Because our big thing is creating one really smart test and then create another really smart test that reproduces, like you might have only 4 flows that reproduce 90% of your regular like consumer flows. Your users, 90% of them do the same 4 things. But that should all be in one test, which includes preparing yourself for like an unexpected 401, for example. So that's something to add on, like if statements. That's how it is in our platform. Whatever programming language you use, there's going to be an if possibility. Use ifs. Get ready for that possibility. Do you have some tricks for testing the security of an API? If you actually go to our website, actually we have different websites, apitestinguniversity.com, we have a section called security. And again, we're not a security testing company. What we are is a functional testing company, but 95% of security issues are due to functional errors and or human error. So what we do is we'll list out some of the biggest players in those screw-ups, such as allowing a wildcard, not testing. You need to stress test your APIs at the very least to make sure that some of the trickier ones have throttling. You shouldn't be able to hit an API to an unlimited amount, because that's what happens when you're doing searching for a package and you say, let me just keep making up numbers till I hit one. Those are the sorts of things you need to keep an eye on. Can 3-leg oAuth be tested automatically? It can, actually. We have an open source library. It's actually, you're not supposed to, it's against the TOS of any sort of 3-legs, like log in with Facebook. You're not supposed to automate it. If you choose to do it, it's on your own. But if you go to API Fortress's GitHub, we have something called 3OA. So it's a 3-leg OAuth assistance library that helps you do that if you choose to do it. It's not our choice. It's not us. It's your choice. So again, I want to thank you. My name's Patrick. If you have more questions, my teammate Will can help you as well, will at apifortress.com. I'm Patrick at apifortress.com. Our website has a bunch of information, especially under resources. If you're looking for white papers, and that URL earlier about the checklist is part of our solution brief. We're just trying to educate people out there as to what is the bare necessities for proper API testing. No matter what system you use, doesn't have to be us. We don't care about that necessarily. I love it when it is us, but the reality is, I'm a consumer using a phone that has a bunch of apps that are releasing my information that I don't want to be released. I want these apps to work, but I also want them to be secure. And security comes with functional testing and functional monitoring. And so for us, it's all about just let's do the job well, and then we can focus on what sort of choices you make from a platform or process system. But at a core, let's all agree to the basic tenets of what's quality, API quality. And that's end-to-end testing, data-driven testing, monitoring and performance testing, all working together across teams. Thank you.